In January of 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave what has come to be known as his Four Freedoms speech. He did not know at that time that by the end of the year, the U.S. would have been attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese and that the nation would be at war. He did believe, however, that the Axis powers were out to destroy all the democracies in the world, including the United States, and he wanted to convince Americans to stop staying neutral and stop insisting on staying out of foreign entanglements and instead step up to what he saw as the American duty on the international scene. He said this: "In the future years, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedoms of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, anywhere in the world. That is no vision of a distant age. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation." Those four freedoms again: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Despite Roosevelt's optimism, his vision was manifestly not, quote, "a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation," end quote. 80 years on, we are far from attaining those goals for American citizens, let alone for other nations. As an internationalist vision, it did not come true, and it can't come true. Many Americans have come to understand the folly of attempting to universalize Western visions of freedom. Nowadays, we call that colonialism. That said, I deeply believe that Roosevelt's four freedoms can and should be the goal of American domestic politics. Freedom of speech and expression, we have achieved and maybe even overachieved. Freedom of worship, we have achieved after a fashion, despite the de facto Christian theocracy that often shows its ugly head in the U.S. But freedom from want and freedom from fear, we're not even close. Memorial Day is about more than breaking out the barbecue grill for the year. Traditionally, we set aside this time for honoring and mourning U.S. war dead. It is, I think, then, an appropriate time for us to reflect upon what it means to be a citizen of the United States and what are those unrealized ideals and dreams. I want to share a story with you. It's a war story written by my father. He had a sixth grade education, so it's not exactly literary, but he was a replacement during the Battle of the Ardennes in 1944. That's popularly known as the Battle of the Bulge of the Second World War. American casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured, was 89,500. Of those, 19,000 were killed, and those are the sacrifices that we memorialize on Memorial Day. I will share with you the stories of two of those crosses in the cemetery where those 19,000 Americans are buried. This was written by my father. He was 20 years old at the time, and he was one of 22,000 replacements that rushed to the front. He said this: "As we was clearing the woods, they needed someone to go back into the village to pick up some rations. So as usual, me and two more boys was selected. We walked back, I would say 3 miles or so. We didn't get the goods because it seems the rations had already been sent up. So we started back to the company. But boy, all heck broke loose. By now, the Germans was using tanks and mortars." Now, I should note that my father was not a practiced writer, and he has left out some important details here. The three going back to their unit did not know that their unit had retreated. They were making a frontal assault alone on the German front. My father goes on: "As we walked up this lane, the shells started coming in, cutting the trees up. As we was walking, we hear this shell screaming. So the three of us fell flat on our faces, as was the customary thing to do. but my buddies fell on one side of the road and I fell on the other. One of my buddies was killed instantly. He never made a sound. The other buddy jumped up saying, "They killed Chev and I'm hit." So he started running up the road. Again, a note, he was running toward the German line. Back to my father. Boy, I was scared. Them limbs was falling off the trees, red shrapnel was flying. So I saw a German pillbox a few hundred yards away. I made a run for it, made it, went inside. The shrapnel was coming in through the slots left for poking your rifle through. After a while in the evening sometime, it all quiets down. There I was, alone, lost from my company and squad. I was so scared and so shook up. When I got back in touch with my company the next afternoon, they had really been cut up. There was just one man left in my squad. Now today, the Battle of the Ardennes is history. Many military historians claim it will be, due to changes in military technology, the last large land battle in human history. But when something is history, it's easy to forget that human cost. Those two young men on the front lines for less than a week when they died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The total number of American military personnel that we celebrate on this Memorial Day weekend for all our wars stands at 1.1 million. Many, many more of our fellow citizens have suffered and died as a result of attempting to live with their experiences of the war, such as my father. That's what I invite you to consider today. The past as alive, and inviting all of us into a conversation about the future. Are we as citizens about freedom? If so, what sort of freedom are we about? Consider a thought from the great 18th century British parliamentarian and founder of the modern political conservatism movement, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke says this, quote, "Society is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As it stands, of such a partnership cannot be attained in many generations. It becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are dead and those who are yet to be born." Those words. It becomes a partnership not only between those of us who are living, but between those who are dead and those who are to be born. Now, I want to bounce that idea off another idea, this one from Konstantin Fasolt, who is a professor of history at the University of Chicago. He writes this, "History is the product of a technology. It does not simply lie around like stones or apples ready to be picked up by anyone who pleases. It must first be produced." History, he says, must be produced. And I take that in two different senses. History is created by the lived experiences of human beings. That's easy enough to see. But history is also a product of cultural forces that are always interpreting history, rewriting history, if you will, to reflect the culture of the present time period. Now, on this Memorial Day weekend, in the midst of a pandemic that's killing African Americans at 3 times the rate of Euro Americans in this country, we do well, I think, to reflect on the dead and the living and those yet to be born. On this weekend set aside to honor the nation's military sacrifices, it is incredibly important to remember our ancestors, to remember both the stated aspirations and the dark manipulations of our forebears. The dead, us, and those to be. We all need to talk. Because, as the great Harlem Renaissance novelist and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston wrote, "If you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it." As I've said many times, bad theology is dangerous, as bad philosophy is too, and so are motivated tellings of history. Some things can be discovered by digging in the archives, however, sometimes concrete things that tell us concrete realities. The so-called father of the U.S. Constitution was James Madison. He was the fourth president of the U.S., and he wrote most of the text of the U.S. Constitution, and he also wrote the Bill of Rights. Madison was many things. He was a Virginian like Thomas Jefferson. He was a slaveholder like Thomas Jefferson. Also like Jefferson, Madison was a deist who had a dim view of Christianity. He had a tenacious belief in religious freedom, even opposing chaplains in the army and in the legislature. The word God does not appear in the U.S. Constitution because Madison did not write that into the document, and he resisted the efforts of Christian politicians to put it back in later. Madison was very clear and outspoken about his beliefs. He wrote this, quote, "Religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise, every expanded prospect." How did he feel about that? Religion is about bondage, he thought. It, quote, "shackles and debilitates the mind," end quote. Religion makes the mind unfit, quote, "for every noble enterprise, every expanded project." How did he feel about that, I wonder? He's pretty clear, isn't he? The chief author of the U.S. Constitution thought that religion and government don't mix because religion shackles and debilitates the mind, and Madison's view of the possibilities of American government was as unshackled, at least for rich white men. It doesn't matter if me or you disagree with Madison on this point that he had about religion. It's merely that is what he thought. We know that is how Madison regarded religion. That's why the word God does not appear in the Constitution, and it's why the First Amendment establishes a wall of separation between religion and government. Allow me to quote another historian at this point. This is the historian Herbert Butterfield, and he wrote this: "History is never the study of origins. Rather, it is the analysis of all the mediations by which the past has been turned into the present." How the past has been turned into the present. Yes, actually what James Madison thought about God and government is very plain. It's written in the archives, and you can look it up. It's very clear to see it was one of his ideas, just as another of his ideas was that owning enslaved people was fine and good. We don't have to accept the idea that he was always right all the time. We are obligated to worship before the altar of James Madison only if we choose to. We can see that he was flawed as a human being. But history is about that process, and we today are not obligated to think as the founders of this nation thought. We can examine the values of our own time, and we have the right and the obligation to remain in that dialogue that Edmund Burke mentioned. We must listen to the dead. We must look with a skeptical eye at our own time and our own opinions, and we must consider the rights of those who will live after us. This process leads to what I like to call the din of conversation. I like talking about the din of conversation. It's not a monologue in which one person pontificates and everybody else has to listen. It's not a dialogue in which two people each attempt to convince the other that their viewpoint is somehow better. No, the ideal is conversation, C-O-N, meaning with, and verse, meaning turn, to turn with. No pontificating, no attempting to win an argument, turning with, being together, sticking together, and listening. Listen to the long history of humanity. There is so much conversation. There is so much to learn from the dead. There is so much to learn from the living here today. And there is so much to consider about those voices that will be here long after all of us are gone. Will we listen to the words of those long forward, those long dead? Can we live into an ideal of government and citizenship, calling the past out, calling the past a liar? Can we do that? Even the wreckage of the past can inform our present to help us make better choices. All of us need to talk, the dead, the living, and the unborn. We need to converse. We need a den of conversation. Let's insist that the war dead did not die in vain. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Let's make those our goals. Let's heed the wise words of James Madison, who wrote this: "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power and knowledge that knowledge gives. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." Today, the nation we have is both a farce and a tragedy. Today, the nation teaches others only by negative example. Today, as we remember our war dead, we are coming perilously close to wasting their lives. Might we honor the dead and respect the unborn by achieving those four freedoms? A freedom of speech and expression that speaks responsibly. A freedom of worship that respects all beliefs and no beliefs at all. A freedom from want and a freedom from fear, such that being born in this nation will not be a pre-existing condition and a ticket to an early grave. Zora Neale Hurston, a humanist and one of the preeminent thinkers and writers of her time, died penniless and was buried in an unmarked grave. She is speaking to us still. If you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.